The amphitheater of the galactic Concord was a marvel of alien architecture, a structure so vast that clouds sometimes formed near its ceiling, drifting lazily between the suspended observation platforms of species who preferred altitude. 412 civilizations had sent delegates here today. Some breathed methane. Some communicated through color shifts in their skin. Some were so ancient they had watched stars die from their homeworld windows. And every single one of them was laughing at the humans. Ambassador Ilara Voss stood at the central podium, a small, dark-haired woman in her mid-40s, dressed in the deep navy uniform of the United Earth Diplomatic Corps, and she did not flinch. Not once. Not even when the Kethar delegate, High Admiral Dros Vethon, rose from his seat and activated the holographic display that filled the entire chamber with a side-by-side comparison of human and Kethar warships. The difference was embarrassing. There was no other word for it. The Kethar vessel was a blade, sleek, predatory, 4 kilometers long, its hull plated with energy-reactive armor that could absorb and redirect weapons fire. Its drive system produced thrust that bent local spacetime. Its weapons could reduce a small moon to rubble in under an hour. The human vessel beside it looked like someone had bolted engines to a warehouse. Laughter rippled across the chamber, not in the human sense, but in species-specific ways that the translation implant behind Ilara's ear faithfully converted into the universal language of mockery. The Vrelian delegates, tall, blue-skinned merchants who wore their wealth in the number of golden rings threaded through their facial fins, clicked their mandibles in rhythmic amusement. The Sorathi hive cluster pulsed with bioluminescent ridicule. Even the normally stoic Drenvak observers allowed themselves a slow, contemptuous rotation of their cranial plates. High Admiral Vethon's voice filled the chamber like thunder rolling through a canyon. The United Earth delegation, he announced, has submitted a proposal to include human naval vessels in the joint Concord defensive perimeter along the outer Arren border. The Kethar Dominion wishes to formally respond to this proposal. He gestured at the comparison hologram with one of his 4 upper limbs. With respect. There was nothing respectful about his tone. Human vessels operate on fuel combustion drive systems that were considered primitive by Kethar standards approximately 230 years ago. Vethon continued, reading from his notes in the manner of a professor correcting a failing student. Their weapons rely on kinetic and plasma-based delivery that requires direct line-of-sight targeting, a limitation that every major space power solved before humanity had invented written language. Their sensor arrays function at ranges we would consider tactically useless, and their shielding, he paused here, letting the pause do the work. Their shielding is, by our analysis, decorative. The chamber erupted again. Ilara Voss waited. She was extraordinarily good at waiting. It was, colleagues had noted, almost unsettling, the way she could stand in front of 400 alien species mocking everything her civilization had built and simply breathe. No reddening of the face, no trembling in the jaw, no white-knuckled grip on the podium edge. She had known this was coming. She had, in fact, counted on it. When the noise subsided, she spoke. Her voice was clear and even, and she chose her words with the precision of someone who understood that every syllable she spoke today was being recorded and would be analyzed by intelligence agencies across 40 star systems. The United Earth delegation thanks the Kethar Dominion for its thorough assessment, she said. We acknowledge the technological gap. We have no objection to the Council's conclusions. She collected her datapad from the podium surface. We simply ask that the record reflect our proposal was made in good faith, and that Earth remains committed to the security of all conquered member species. She returned to her seat. High Admiral Vethon watched her go with the expression of a predator who had expected more of a fight and was vaguely disappointed by how easily the prey had crumpled. He did not know, could not have known, that Ilara Voss had spent the shuttle ride to the Concord station reading a classified mission update from a ship that did not officially exist. He did not know that while he was preparing his holographic presentation about the inadequacy of human technology, That ship had spent the previous 6 hours drifting through the outer sensor grid of the Kethar border station at Helix Point. He did not know because the sensors at Helix Point had detected nothing. The patrol wings had seen nothing. The AI monitoring systems had logged nothing. The ship had been there. It had recorded everything. Drive signatures, patrol patterns, weapons readiness states, the encryption handshake protocols used by Kethar border communications. And then it had simply moved on, silent as a held breath, leaving no trace in any system, on any log, in any memory bank across the entire Kethar border network. Ilara sat down, folded her hands in her lap, and watched the rest of the session with calm, attentive eyes. Somewhere on the edge of known space, 11 humans were doing what humans had quietly decided they were better at than anyone in the galaxy. They were watching. They were learning. And they were waiting for the moment when what they knew would matter more than anything the Kethar could ever build. That moment, Ilara Voss had calculated with considerable care, was approximately 19 days away. Kepler 442 asteroid belt was not a pleasant place to build anything. The rocks were dense, irregular, and moved in patterns that required constant navigational adjustment. Radiation from the system's parent star bounced unpredictably off metallic asteroid surfaces, creating interference fields that played havoc with standard sensor equipment. Supply runs required a specific flight path that added 9 hours to a journey that should have taken 3. The artificial gravity inside the station fluctuated twice a week for reasons that the engineering team had been investigating for 2 years without resolution. Commander Idris Kane had chosen it specifically for all of these reasons. Cradle Station was built into the core of a 2-kilometer asteroid that had been quietly hollowed out over 7 years using equipment purchased through 14 layers of civilian mining contracts. From the outside, it looked like any one of 10,000 unremarkable rocks drifting through the belt. From the inside, it was the most sophisticated and most secret military research facility humanity had ever constructed, more classified than the Manhattan Project, more expensive than the entire Apollo program, more consequential, if Kane's work succeeded, than anything humanity had ever attempted. Kane himself looked like the kind of man who had been designed specifically to disappear into the background. Medium height, unremarkable features, hair the color of old ash kept short enough to be irrelevant. He wore his uniform the way some people wore a habit, not because it was required, but because it helped him feel ordered. He was 41 years old and had spent the last 11 of those years on a project that he was not permitted to discuss with his family, his doctors, or, on one memorably uncomfortable occasion, the military psychologist assigned to evaluate his fitness for continued classified work. The psychologist had cleared him. Kane suspected this said more about the psychologist's limitations than his own mental health. He was standing now at the primary observation window, 3 inches of transparent titanium compound separating him from the vacuum of the asteroid's hollowed interior bay, watching his ship come home. Except he couldn't see it. That was the point. That was the entire point. He knew the pale ember was there because his datapad told him so. The docking system's mechanical arms had made contact 2 minutes ago. The airlock sequence was cycling. The ship was right in front of him, 40 meters away, and all he could see through the observation window was the empty bay, the docking cradle, and the mechanical arms clutching at what appeared to be nothing. It was, he thought, the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. The pale ember was not a cloaked ship. Cloaking, the bending of light around a vessel to render it visually invisible, was well-understood technology. The Kethar had developed it a century ago. The Vrelians had reverse-engineered it within a decade. Cloak detection systems were now standard equipment on every military vessel in the Concord. A cloaked ship still had mass, still displaced gas particles, still generated trace gravitational variance and residual drive radiation. A cloaked ship was, to modern sensor systems, roughly as subtle as a person hiding behind a curtain, visible as a shape even if the details were obscured. The pale ember did something fundamentally different, and it had taken Kane 9 years to make it work. The ship's outer hull was layered with a material that Kane's team had taken to calling null plate, a composite of quantum state-locked metamaterials that interacted with electromagnetic radiation in a way that should have been theoretically impossible. Instead of reflecting, absorbing, or bending incoming signals, null plate agreed with them. An incoming radar pulse hit the hull and kept going, its waveform subtly reshaped by the plate's quantum interaction, so that it continued propagating exactly as though it had passed through empty space. Light behaved the same way. Every form of electromagnetic detection humanity or any known alien civilization had developed operated on the same basic principle: send out a signal, detect what comes back. The pale ember made sure nothing ever came back. This alone would have been revolutionary. Kane had not stopped there. The ship's drives were a masterwork of gravitational engineering, developed by a physicist named Dr. Yevgenia Ostrova, who had died of heart failure 3 years ago in this very station, and whose name would never appear in any publication or memorial, because the work was classified at a level that didn't officially exist. Ostrova had solved the stealth drive problem that had defeated every previous attempt at building a truly undetectable ship. Movement through space, even with no electromagnetic signature, created gravitational variance. Mass moving through spacetime left a wake, subtle but measurable, like a boat on water detectable by the ripples long after it had passed. Ostrova's drive didn't push the ship through space. It renegotiated the local curvature of spacetime around it, creating a bubble in which the ship effectively remained stationary while space itself moved. The gravitational wake was indistinguishable from natural variance in the interstellar medium. The result was a ship that did not hide from the universe. It simply convinced the universe it wasn't there. Kane stepped back from the viewport as the airlock indicator turned green. He had a briefing to run. The crew of the Pale Ember had been at Helix Point, and what they had recorded was going to change the shape of the next 3 months. He picked up his coffee, cold, forgotten, 2 hours old, took a sip without noticing, and went to work. He did not know yet how much worse things were about to get. 11 people. That was the crew of the Pale Ember. 11 people to operate a vessel that represented the single most expensive and most advanced project in the history of human spaceflight. When Admiral Chen of the Strategic Development Command had first seen that number on Kane's proposal, she had laughed. Not the way the Kethar delegates had laughed at Alara Voss, but with genuine disbelief. "You want to crew a classified stealth ship with 11 people," she had said flatly. 11. 13 is too many, Kane had replied, without any apparent awareness of how that sounded. The operational security risk scales exponentially with crew size. Every additional person is another potential leak, another psychological variable, another body that needs food and air and space. 11 is the number the mission architecture requires. Chen had stared at him for a long moment. "You've already run the numbers." "I've run them 6 times. She had approved it. The 11 had been selected through a process that made Special Forces recruitment look casual. It wasn't just skill. The galaxy had plenty of skilled people, and skill could be detected, measured, quantified, prepared against. What Kane and the selection committee needed was something harder to define and harder to train. The specific psychological architecture that allowed a human being to function in a state of perfect, indefinite invisibility. No recognition, no acknowledgement, no record. You could be the greatest intelligence operative in human history, perform acts of unimaginable strategic value, and return home to an apartment in a city where no one knew your name and a service record that officially listed you as a mid-level logistics coordinator for a mining company in the Outer Belt. You would never be thanked publicly. You would never be decorated. You would grow old and die, and the civilization you had protected would never know your face. Most people, when confronted with this reality in the psychological screening process, found reasons to withdraw. The 11 who remained had found something else instead. Captain Sierra Mao had found it first. She was 44 years old, built with the lean economy of someone who spent her calories on function rather than appearance, with dark eyes that processed threat assessment the way other people processed weather, continuously, automatically, without urgency. She had come up through special reconnaissance, then deep cover operations, then a 3-year assignment so classified that even Kane didn't have full access to her file. She had operated alone, in hostile territory, for periods of up to 8 months. She spoke Cathar with a regional accent. She had once spent 11 days in a Vrelian merchant station with a false identity and a compromised communication uplink, and had extracted herself and her intelligence package without firing a single shot. Her crew called her the Null. She had heard the nickname and neither acknowledged nor discouraged it, which was, everyone agreed, extremely on brand. Chief Engineer Tobias Frey was the reason the ship worked at all. Not Kane. Kane was the architect, the theorist, the man who had looked at the laws of physics and found the door they were hiding. But Frey was the man who had walked through that door and built something on the other side. He was 51, barrel-chested, with hands that looked too large for the delicate work they performed, and a mind that could hold 17 simultaneous variables without writing any of them down. He talked to the ship constantly, not nervously, not as a tick, but with the easy warmth of someone conversing with a trusted partner. During long transit periods, other crew members had occasionally stopped outside the engine compartment just to listen to him work and murmur and sometimes laugh at something only he understood. The ship seemed to run better when he was talking to it. This was, scientifically, impossible. Frey maintained it was simply a matter of paying attention. Navigator Yuki Shen was 29 and had the stillness of someone who had learned very early that the world rewarded patience in ways it never rewarded noise. Her specialty was not getting them from point A to point B. The ship's AI handled standard navigation, but rather the art of moving through space occupied by hostile forces without disturbing the pattern of their activity. She thought of enemy patrol routes the way a pickpocket thought of a crowd, not as obstacles but as rhythms, predictable and exploitable. Her secondary specialty was signals intelligence, and she could extract meaning from an intercepted transmission, the way a musician heard structure in what others heard as noise. The other 8 crew members, engineers, a medic, 2 intelligence analysts, a weapons specialist who had thus far found no reason to use his particular expertise, and a communications officer named Dahl who hadn't spoken above a whisper in so long that the rest of the crew wasn't sure he still could, were each remarkable in ways that would never be publicly recorded. Their current orders were straightforward and chilling in equal measure. The Arren Protectorate was a small civilization, 3 inhabited systems, roughly 4 billion people across 2 settled planets, a species of gentle, arthropod-like beings who had developed spaceflight 40 years ago and spent most of it exploring. They had no military. They had never needed one. They were, by common consensus in the Concord, the most diplomatically agreeable species ever admitted to membership, unfailingly courteous, inclined toward cooperation, and completely incapable of defending themselves from anyone who decided they wanted what the Arren had. What the Arren had, it had recently been discovered, was a rare mineral called vernite in their system's asteroid fields, a material with properties that made it extraordinarily useful in the construction of quantum state drives. Drives, specifically, like the one that powered the Pale Ember. The Cathar 7th Fleet had begun massing along the Arren border 6 weeks ago. They had given no official explanation. The Concord had issued 2 requests for clarification that had gone unanswered. Unofficially, the intelligence community's best guess was military exercises. The Pale Ember's orders were to enter Cathar space, observe the fleet, and determine what was actually happening. Captain Mao read the orders once, filed them in her memory, and set a course. The ship slid out of Cradle Station's docking bay and disappeared, not into darkness, not behind cover. It simply stopped being something the universe could find. Yuki Shen set the intercept course for the Cathar fleet's last known position, noted 3 probable patrol routes they would need to thread, and started the clock. The Cathar 7th Fleet was not conducting exercises. Yuki Shen had known this within 40 minutes of the Pale Ember entering the fleet's operational zone, and she had used those 40 minutes to verify it 3 separate times before she opened the channel to Captain Mao's command seat, because the intelligence analyst in her refused to walk into that conversation with anything less than certainty. "Captain," she said, "you need to come see this." What they saw when Mao arrived at the sensor station and the full picture assembled itself on the display screen was so comprehensive, so deliberate, and so unmistakably final in its intent that the entire bridge fell silent. 340 warships, the 7th Fleet at full strength, every vessel accounted for, plus a reinforcement wing that didn't appear in any Concord-filed Cathar military registry, which meant it had been mobilized covertly, specifically for this operation. That alone was a violation of 6 separate Concord military transparency treaties. But it was not the warships that made Yuki's hands go cold. It was the atmosphere breakers. There were 12 of them, parked at the fleet's center in a protective ring of destroyer escorts. They were unglamorous vessels, boxy, slow, carrying no conventional weapons. What they carried instead were orbital deployment systems loaded with thermocatalytic saturation charges, devices designed to be released into a planet's upper atmosphere, where they triggered a cascading chemical reaction that heated the atmosphere from the inside out, destabilizing weather patterns, destroying ozone coverage, and rendering the surface uninhabitable within 72 hours. The Arren had 2 settled planets. There were 12 atmosphere breakers. The math was not complicated. "How long have they been here?" Mao asked quietly. "Configuration suggests final staging," Yuki said. "They're not still arriving. They're ready. My best estimate for operational launch is 11 to 15 days, pending whatever they're waiting for." "What are they waiting for?" "That's what I can't." Yuki stopped. Her screen had flagged something. She leaned forward, processing, and the cold in her hand spread slowly up her arms. "Captain, I've been running passive intercepts on their command channel. It's encrypted, but it's a Cathar military-grade cipher, and we have the base architecture from the Helix Point operation. Give me 6 hours and I can break it." Mao looked at her. "Break it." It took 4 hours and 40 minutes. What the decrypted transmissions revealed was not simply a military operation. It was a coordinated political conspiracy that reached from the Cathar High Command directly into the chambers of the Galactic Concord itself. The transmissions detailed a plan called Operation Quiet Inheritance, a name whose bureaucratic blandness made its contents feel even more obscene. The Cathar would move against the Arren with overwhelming force, taking the Vernite deposits before any Concord response could be organized. The operation relied on a 12-day window in which 2 Concord delegates, the Vrelian Collective's senior representative, Merchant Lord Sevon, and a Sorathi diplomat named Choir of the Third Morning, had agreed to sit on any emergency session requests, citing procedural review delays, buying the Cathar fleet time to complete its operation before the Concord could legally intervene. In exchange, the Vrelians would receive preferred mining rights to 30% of the captured Vernite deposits. 4 billion people, traded for 30% of a mineral contract. Yuki sat back from her screen and put her hands flat on the console surface, very deliberately, because she needed to feel something solid. "I've documented everything," she said. "Every transmission, every name, every timestamp." Mao was standing at the center of the bridge, and she was doing the thing she did in crisis, going completely, preternaturally still, like a compass finding north. "Crew assembly," she said. "Mess hall 10 minutes." They gathered in the cramped space that served as their common area, 11 people around a table designed for 8, shoulders touching, the air recyclers humming their constant quiet background note. Mao laid it out without decoration. The fleet, the atmosphere breakers, The Concord Conspiracy, the timeline, the 4 billion people who did not know they were 11 days away from extinction. Then she put her hands on the table and looked at each of them in turn. "We cannot fight this fleet," she said. "We have no weapons capable of threatening 340 warships. We cannot outrun a distress call. The moment we transmit anything, they'll triangulate and pursue. What we can do is what we came here to do, and we can choose what we do with what we know. I'll tell you what I think we should do, and then I want to hear from every single one of you." She told them. When she finished, Tobias Frey was the first to speak. "So we stay," he said. It wasn't a question. "We stay," Mal confirmed. "And we take the whole thing apart," Yuki said slowly. "From the inside." "From the inside," Mal said, without firing a single shot. The vote was 11-0, unanimous. No one spoke for a moment after it was cast, and the silence in the mess hall was a different kind of silence than the operational quiet they lived in every day. It was the silence of 11 people choosing something large. Tobias Frey broke it by pushing back his chair, stretching his enormous hands above his head, and saying, with deep professional satisfaction, "Right then, let me tell you what I think the engine can do." What Tobias Frey thought the engine could do turned out to be considerably more than it was technically designed for, which was exactly the kind of statement that made Commander Kane's eye twitch when he read the operational report 6 weeks later, and exactly the kind of creative structural abuse that made the Pale Ember the most dangerous vessel in the known galaxy. The plan was elegant in the way that truly dangerous things tend to be elegant. It solved a complex problem through simple, repeatable actions, each one small enough to be overlooked, collectively devastating. They started with the fuel chain. The Kethar 7th Fleet was enormous, and enormous things consume resources at an enormous rate. The fleet's fuel logistics were handled by a network of 31 automated relay tankers, large, slow, minimally crewed vessels that moved on pre-programmed routes between the fleet's perimeter and a fuel depot established at the edge of the staging zone. The tankers were not warships. They carried no significant defensive systems. They were, in the strategic vocabulary of naval warfare, considered uncontested assets, so protected by the surrounding fleet that defending them individually was considered unnecessary. No naval strategist in the Concord had ever needed to plan for a threat that the protecting fleet could not detect. The Pale Ember moved to the first tanker at 4 in the morning, Kethar ship time, when watch rotations were at minimum alertness, and the tanker's own 2-person crew was asleep. Frey had modified the phase diffusion system's external emitters. The null plate that made the Pale Ember invisible worked by convincing electromagnetic signals they'd pass through empty space. With some creative reconfiguration, those same emitters could project a localized phase diffusion field around an external object, not making it invisible, but putting its power systems into a state of quantum-locked dormancy. Every active system on the tanker, drive, communications, sensors, even the emergency beacon, would simply stop, its operating state frozen at the quantum level. Not destroyed, not visibly damaged, just stopped. The Kethar would find a tanker that appeared, externally, completely intact. They would simply be unable to turn it on. It took 8 minutes per tanker. Over the course of 4 days, working systematically through the logistics chain, the Pale Ember visited all 31 fuel tankers. All 31 went dark. All 31 sat in space looking perfectly fine and refusing to operate. The effect on the Kethar fleet was not immediate. The fleet had reserve fuel capacity, but it was inevitable. And because the tankers looked fine, the initial response was not alarm but confusion. Engineering teams were dispatched. Diagnostic reports came back clean. The ships were simply not running. Fleet Command began receiving queries from its own logistics division that it did not know how to answer. They had no framework for what was happening, because what was happening had never happened before. While Frey managed the tankers, Yuki Shen went to work on the fleet's communications architecture. The Kethar command network relied on a series of relay drones positioned throughout the staging zone, rebroadcasting command signals from the fleet's command vessel to its outlying wings. These drones were small, numerous, and operated on tight beam encrypted channels, normally very difficult to interfere with. The pale ember didn't interfere with them, it moved them. Working across 3 nights, with pilot Ensign Rail Cho demonstrating a degree of precision docking with non-cooperative objects that will likely never appear in any training manual, because it is almost certainly impossible. The crew physically relocated 23 of the fleet's 48 relay drones to different positions, close enough to their original locations that the network's redundancy systems didn't flag them as missing, far enough that the signals they rebroadcast were subtly, systematically wrong. Patrol orders arrived at wings with coordinates offset by a fraction of a degree, enough to send them to empty space. Formation commands were reflected back on 4-hour delays, so that fleet elements were responding to orders from hours ago, while new orders piled up undelivered. 2 destroyer wings were given each other's patrol signatures as friend or foe identifiers, and spent the better part of 6 hours in a mutual pursuit that their own network couldn't resolve, because the communication relays connecting them to Fleet Command were broadcasting in the wrong direction. Not a single weapon was fired by the pale ember. There was no firefight. There was no heroic charge through enemy lines. There was only Yuki's quiet, surgical attention to the flow of information, and Frey's careful hands on systems that had no defense against what he was doing, because no one had ever imagined it was possible. The resupply convoy, 14 ships carrying munitions, replacement parts, and the food supplies that a fleet of 340 vessels consumed at a staggering daily rate, followed a false nav beacon that Yuki had substituted into the logistics channel 4 days earlier. The convoy traveled, in good order and complete confidence, to a gravitational dead zone 17 light minutes from their intended destination, parked in standard convoy formation, and waited for a docking signal that would never come. Their communications, routed through the now-displaced relay network, were going nowhere in particular. The convoy waited, the fleet starved for supplies, and the careful, invisible catastrophe that 11 people were building one quiet action at a time continued to unfold. By day 12, the Kethar 7th Fleet's internal logs, which the pale ember's sensors were passively recording in their entirety, showed escalating command confusion, 4 internal investigations into suspected sabotage, 2 accusations of incompetence directed at senior logistics officers, and a fleet-wide review of all systems that found nothing wrong with anything because nothing, by conventional diagnostic standards, was wrong. Fleet Admiral Cress Vathon, the High Admiral's brother, commanding the 7th from his flagship, the Eternal Ascendancy, sent a message to Kethar High Command on day 13. Operation Quiet Inheritance is not ready. We have experienced systemic logistics failure of unknown origin. Request 12-day delay. The message was also intercepted by Yuki Shen, who added it to the intelligence package with what her colleagues would later describe as visible satisfaction. Yuki Shen had been awake for 19 hours when she finished the intelligence package, and she would not remember most of them. She remembered starting. She remembered the systematic architecture of it, sorting the transmissions chronologically, cross-referencing names against conquered delegate registries, verifying encryption keys, authenticating timestamps with the pale ember's own independent chronometer, so that no one could later claim the timestamps had been falsified. She remembered at some point eating half a protein bar without tasting it and setting the other half down and forgetting it existed. She did not remember the moment she realized the package was complete. She became aware of it the way you become aware of a room going quiet, not as an event, but as an absence of the thing that had been demanding her attention. It sat on her screen, 5,412 individual files, cross-indexed, authenticated, and assembled into a narrative so clear, and so thoroughly documented that a first-year law student could have presented it to any judicial body in the Concord and won. She called Captain Mao. Mao arrived, read through the summary index, and was silent for a moment. Then she said, 3 targets. 3 targets, Yuki confirmed. They had argued about this, the whole crew, across 2 long evenings in the mess hall, because where you sent the intelligence was itself a strategic decision, and strategy in a situation like this could mean the difference between 4 billion people living and 4 billion people becoming a historical footnote. The Concord was the obvious choice, but the Concord had already been penetrated. Sending the package through normal channels risked it being suppressed by the same delegates who had conspired to buy the Cathar time. They needed the Concord engaged, but engaged before the conspirators could contain the situation. The Arren Protectorate needed to know what was coming, not because they could fight it, but because they needed time to scream. A civilization that knew it was targeted and could broadcast that targeting to the galaxy was considerably harder to quietly eliminate than one that never saw it coming. And humanity's free press, specifically the Meridian Independent, a news network with a reputation for rigorous verification and no government affiliation, needed a package with a 36-hour delay trigger. Insurance. If the Concord session was suppressed, if the Arren were somehow silenced, if everything else failed, in 36 hours, every screen in the known galaxy would light up with 5,412 pieces of evidence. The transmissions needed to be untraceable. This was, in the conventional sense, impossible. Every transmission left a point of origin that a sufficiently sophisticated analysis could eventually locate. The pale ember was not a conventional solution. Dahl, the communications officer who had not spoken above a whisper in so long that the crew had stopped noticing it as unusual, had spent the previous 8 days constructing a transmission architecture that used the displaced relay drones, the ones they'd moved throughout the staging zone, as a distributed broadcast network. The package would leave the pale ember and enter the relay network simultaneously from 11 different directions, bounce through 14 relay nodes on paths that contradicted each other, and emerge from the network at 6 separate points along the Cathar fleet's perimeter, all broadcasting simultaneously. It would appear to come from everywhere at once. Any analysis trying to trace the origin would find only a web of Cathar's own communication infrastructure pointing at itself. Ready? Mao asked. Dahl, who had not needed to answer questions above a whisper in quite some time, simply nodded and pressed the transmission key. 5,412 files entered the network simultaneously. The Arren Protectorate government received their package 9 minutes later, via a diplomatic channel that appeared to originate from a Cathar administrative relay, a channel the Arren had no known access to, which would itself become a subject of considerable analysis in the days ahead. The sealed Concord emergency channel received its package 11 minutes later, triggering an automatic protocol that required the Concord chair to convene an emergency session within 48 hours. A protocol so old it predated most current Concord members' governments, invoked only twice before in Concord history, and requiring a supermajority vote to suspend. Not even the Vrelian delegates had the numbers to block it. The Meridian Independent received their package and a note that read only, "Verify everything. You will find that it verifies. Broadcast in 36 hours if you have not already heard from the Concord." The 36-hour timer started. The Meridian's senior editorial team began verifying. In the Cathar staging zone, Fleet Admiral Vathan received a notification that 6 of his communication relay drones were broadcasting on unauthorized channels. By the time his technical teams located and shut down the drones, the transmissions had been in transit for 22 minutes. In the vacuum of space, signals travel at the speed of light. 22 minutes at the speed of light is very, very far. In the Pale Embers mess hall, Tobias Frey made actual coffee, a luxury carefully rationed across the mission, and poured 11 cups. The crew sat together in a silence that was different from any silence they'd maintained in 3 weeks, not the operational quiet of people holding their breath, something warmer, something that felt cautiously like the first exhale. Mao took her coffee, drank half of it, and said, "Now we go home." Yuki looked at her screen one last time. The fleet's internal logs were showing a new development, the first signals of genuine alarm in the command structure, the moment when confusion was beginning to tip into the understanding that something had happened that the Kethar could not explain. She closed the screen. She picked up her coffee. "Now we go home," she agreed. The emergency session of the Galactic Concord was not announced. Emergency sessions under the ancient protocol invoked by the intelligence package were sealed, all delegates summoned, no public notification, no advance briefing on the subject matter. You arrived, and then you learned, and the Concord's rules existed specifically to prevent any party from knowing in advance what they were about to be confronted with. Merchant Lord Sevon of the Vrelian Collective arrived expecting a dispute about transit taxation. The expression on his face when the session chair, Grand Arbiter Thesson of the Drenvok Assembly, opened the session with a full display of the Pale Embers intelligence package. Every transmission, every file, projected in simultaneous translation across all 412 delegate screens, was something that the session's recording system would preserve in extraordinary high resolution for the next several centuries. It was the face of a being who had just understood, all at once, what it felt like to be completely and perfectly caught. Thesson let the initial display run for 6 full minutes before she spoke. 6 minutes during which the chamber was so quiet that the soft atmospheric processors were audible. 6 minutes during which Sevon and his 4 delegate colleagues remained completely still, and the Kethar delegation sat in a stillness of a different kind, the stillness of people doing rapid, desperate arithmetic. "The Galactic Concord," Thesson said, in the measured cadence of someone who has spent 200 years in diplomatic chambers and knows exactly when to go slow, "is in receipt of an intelligence disclosure that constitutes, under Articles 17, 42, and 93 of the Concord Charter, prima facie evidence of coordinated military aggression against a protected species, conspiracy to commit a war crime, and willful obstruction of Concord emergency protocols by seated delegates." She paused. "We will begin with the Kethar delegation." What followed was 3 hours of extraordinary theater. The Kethar delegation's first move was denial. A denial so total and so immediately undermined by the specificity of the evidence that it lasted less than 12 minutes before the senior Kethar delegate, a career diplomat named Ashan Rel, pivoted without announcement to claiming the documents were fabricated. This line held for approximately 20 minutes, until the Meridian Independence broadcast reached the Concord station, and every delegate's personal communication device simultaneously notified them that independent civilian journalists had spent 30 hours verifying the same documents, and were now broadcasting their verification analysis across every public channel in Concord space. The second collapse came from within. The Kethar military attaché, a younger officer who had clearly not been part of the original conspiracy, and had arrived at this session believing he was attending a routine military liaison meeting, requested permission to address the council privately. This request was, under the sealed session protocol, impossible to deny. He disappeared into a side chamber with 3 Concord legal advocates for 40 minutes. When he returned, he filed a formal statement of cooperation and began providing context for the documents that the documents did not already supply. After that, it went quickly. Merchant Lord Sevon attempted to leave the chamber at hour 2. The Concord's marshal service, which had been discreetly positioned at every exit since the session began, politely informed him that under Article 64, another old protocol, rarely invoked, delegates under investigation during a sealed emergency session could not leave until the session chair released them. Sevon stood at the sealed door for a long moment, then returned to his seat with a composure that fooled no one and which he appeared to maintain through sheer force of habit. Choir of the third morning, the Sorathi diplomat named in the transmissions, formally dissolved its connection to the Sorathi delegation and requested classification as an individual respondent rather than a representative. A legal maneuver so arcane it required 3 conquered archivists to verify it was possible, which it was, under a precedent from a session held 400 years ago. Through all of this, Ambassador Ilara Voss sat in the United Earth delegation sector and watched. She was asked once by Grand Arbiter Thesson to address the source of the intelligence package. The question was asked gently, in the tone of someone who understood they might not receive an answer, because the legal framework of the session did not require Earth to disclose sources, and the Arbiter knew it. Ilara stood. She folded her hands at the podium. "The United Earth delegation," she said, "provided the Conquered with actionable intelligence through a classified collection method that we are not at liberty to disclose. The authentication of the documents is a matter for the Conquered's own verification teams, whose report you have before you." She looked at the chamber, at 412 species looking back at her, trying to work out what they were looking at. The evidence speaks for itself. Earth's position is simply that it does. She returned to her seat. In the corridor outside the chamber, during a brief recess, a delegate from the Heron technocracy, one of the Conquered's oldest and most sophisticated military powers, fell quietly into step beside her. "Ambassador," the delegate said softly, "a question off the record." "Of course." "Your collection method," a pause, "how long has it been operational?" Ilara smiled, not the diplomatic smile she deployed in session, a different smile, quieter. "Long enough," she said. The delegate walked away slowly, the way beings do when they are reassessing something they had previously thought they understood. The session reconvened. The Kethar 7th Fleet received formal Conquered orders to stand down and withdraw, backed by the immediate deployment of 3 Conquered peacekeeping fleets. They complied within 4 hours, the fastest military compliance in Conquered emergency history, a speed that was almost certainly related to the fact that the fleet had been trying without success for 11 days to understand why its logistics system had collapsed, and was not operationally eager to test itself. The Arren Protectorate received formal enhanced protection status. Their delegates, who had attended the session in stunned, speechless horror at what had nearly happened, were still in the chamber 2 hours after everyone else had left. Ilara sent one encrypted message, brief and total, to Kepler 442. "Well done, come home." She sat for a moment at her desk, the session recording still running on her screen, and allowed herself 30 seconds of something she almost never permitted in a professional context. She was proud. Of them, of the work, of what 11 invisible people had done in the dark where no one would ever know they'd been. Then she closed the recording, opened her briefing files for tomorrow, and got back to work. 6 months is a long time. 6 months is also, in the scale of galactic politics, barely a breath. The Kethar Dominion spent those 6 months in what the Conquered formally classified as mandatory structural review, a diplomatic phrase that meant their military command structure was being taken apart and examined at the insistence of every other major power in the Conquered, all of whom were now acutely aware that the Kethar had come within 11 days of an atrocity and had nearly gotten away with it. High Admiral Dross Vethon, the one who had laughed at human ships in the Conquered chamber, resigned his position before the review began. The resignation was described as voluntary. No one who knew him believed this. The Vrelian Collective faced a tribunal. Merchant Lord Sevan did not attend its first 3 sessions due to what his legal team described as health concerns. He attended the 4th when the tribunal's marshal arrived at his residence. The proceedings were long and complicated and would not conclude for another 2 years, but the conclusion, all observers agreed, was not in question. The Arren Protectorate underwent something that had no formal name in galactic political science, because it had never happened before. A civilization that had been 4 billion people away from extinction, that had not known until 12 hours before the crisis broke that it had ever been in danger, was now a protected species with 3 peacekeeping fleets in its border zones, and a level of conquered political attention that it found simultaneously reassuring and slightly overwhelming. Their lead diplomat, an Auren elder named HFY of Longwaters, gave a public address that was broadcast across every conquered member network. The address was long and deeply personal, and included a section that became widely quoted, the part where HFY described trying to understand who had saved them, and why, and being told only that the source was classified and that the evidence spoke for itself. "We do not know who watched over us," HFY said. "We do not know their names or their faces or the shape of their vessel. We know only that someone chose to see us when they could have chosen to look away. And that choice, made in darkness, by people who will receive no recognition for it, is the most profound thing one civilization can do for another." In a small apartment in a mid-density district of Melbourne, Australia, a woman named Yuki Shen watched the broadcast on a screen propped against a stack of books, eating takeout noodles, and did not tell anyone what she was feeling. She had been home for 3 weeks. She was officially listed, on all employment records, as a logistics coordinator for an outer belt mining operation. She had a sister who thought she'd been on an extended research survey. She had a neighbor who occasionally brought her newspaper by mistake and once asked about her work. She had said it was fine, routine, not very interesting really. She finished her noodles and watched HFY of Longwaters talk about people whose names would never be known, and she thought about Tobias talking to the engine, and Dahl's whisper-quiet voice counting down the transmission sequence, and Mao going completely still in the center of the bridge, while the rest of them found their certainty in her certainty. She thought it was probably fine, being unknown. She had chosen it after all. She was mostly convinced she had made the right choice. At Cradle Station, Commander Idris Kane received a set of orders that came directly from Admiral Chen, bypassing all intermediate command layers, encrypted at a level so high that the decryption process took 11 minutes even with Cradle's processing infrastructure. The orders authorized the design and construction of 6 additional Wraith-class vessels. Kane read the orders twice. He set them down on his desk. He looked out the viewport at the empty bay where the pale ember sat invisible in her cradle resting, for the first time in months, systems at minimal operation, Frey's meticulous maintenance schedules ticking along in the background. He thought about what 6 ships meant. 6 ships that didn't exist, crewed by people who didn't officially exist, capable of going anywhere in the known galaxy without any civilization's knowledge or consent. He thought about what the galaxy was going to feel in the coming months and years without knowing what it was feeling or why. The growing, sourceless unease. The intelligence reports that couldn't be explained. The sense, developing slowly in the war rooms and command centers of every major power, that there was something out there, not a ship, not a fleet, not any category of threat they had words for that could watch you and touch you and leave no trace. He thought about how that feeling would change behavior, how admirals would hesitate before ordering the things admirals ordered when they believed no one was watching, how the calculus of what you could do in the dark would shift when the dark no longer felt safe. 6 ships, he thought, 6 ships and the galaxy changes. He picked up his coffee, found it cold, drank it anyway, and reached for the design files. In the pale ember's engine compartment, Tobias Frey was talking to the drive again. It had taken some minor damage on re-entry through radiation belt, nothing serious. A small variance in the quantum lock frequency that created an entirely theoretical risk of the null plate cycling 3 milliseconds slower than optimal. He was explaining to the engine, in patient and affectionate detail, exactly what he was going to do about it and why. In the navigation station, Yuki's replacement, a new hire, one of the candidates who had survived the selection process, was reviewing the sensor logs from the Auren operation, trying to understand how it had been done. She was brilliant and she was trained and she was going to need another year before she was ready. And somewhere beyond Cradle Station, somewhere in the enormous dark of the galaxy, on a course that was filed in no database, logged in no system, visible to no instrument of any civilization in known space. Four of the galaxy's most powerful militaries were quietly wondering if they were being watched. They were being watched by two of the six existing candidates shortlisted for the expanded Wraith program, running silent on assessment missions in preparation for the next phase. The Kethar Empire had ships that could crack moons. The Vrelian Collective had trade networks that spanned 100 star systems. The Heron technocracy had weapons that could destabilize the core of a small star. None of them knew where to look. 11 humans had spent 3 weeks in the middle of the largest military staging operation in a generation, dismantled it without firing a shot, saved 4 billion lives, collapsed a political conspiracy that reached to the top of the galaxy's governing body, and come home to apartments and cover stories and noodles eaten alone in front of a screen. The galaxy had mocked human technology. The galaxy had looked at humanity's slow ships and outdated weapons and primitive sensor systems, and laughed in the grandest chamber of interstellar civilization, in front of 400 watching species, and called humans magnificent relics of a species still learning to crawl. The galaxy had been looking at exactly the wrong thing. The loudest weapon in a room is always the most visible one. Every civilization in the known galaxy had spent centuries building louder and louder weapons, perfecting the art of being seen and feared, and impossible to ignore. Humanity had quietly, patiently, in the cold dark of an asteroid belt, built something else entirely. Not a weapon, not a fleet, not a monument to power that anyone could point at and measure and plan against. A question: are we watching you? The most powerful question in the universe is not one that can be answered. It can only be lived with, carried in every command decision, whispered in every war room, present in the back of every admiral's mind, every time they considered an action they would prefer the galaxy not to see. Are we watching you? The pale ember sat invisible in her cradle, resting between the stars, saying nothing. She didn't need to. And